So why do so many ancient gods across cultures seem to be related to water, like the Nomo, or other people wearing the fish suits, or the god of the ocean or the waters? What is that?
I mean, you can go down the list, obviously starting with Enki and Sumerian, but some of the top level ones like Poseidon, Neptune. But then you get into like the Toltecs and Hindu cultures. They all have these references of what appear to be some type of a god, either associated with the water, representing some type of a suit coming out of the water, or as you mentioned, an association with literally like I'm a fish god of some sort.
Mhm.
So I think it's very interesting that there seems to be a cross-cultural story there.
Yeah.
And, maybe there's something to do with where they come from, being a watery planet. But it is an interesting segue into realizing, who are these people that are visiting us and where do they come from? We start to look for patterns of recognition. That's definitely one of them.
Yeah, definitely. And it really is incredible that you can see this pattern of recognition around the entire planet. Like you said, it's like one continent over here, another continent over here, all a very similar story, and always surrounding water, which means, what scientists say could possibly be true. If they can find a planet with water, there must be life.
And what's really interesting too, Billy, is we spin it into current topics, right? A lot of these gods that are represented look as if they're wearing like an old suit that you would deep dive. You know what I mean? And you're like, well, what does this mean? We have to understand that most likely, yes, they're doing their best to represent visitations with these creatures. What if they're from our own planet? And there's that whole other subterranean existence in our oceans that we still don't know. So I wonder recently, with things going on, right, coming out of the ocean, especially living here off the coast of California, I'm like, what's freaking down there?
Yeah,
Could be
yeah.
ancient gods.
We would never know because we haven't even explored the oceans. So, yeah, it's quite possible there could be some level of an advanced civilization. I remember reading one time that in Christopher Columbus's captain's log, this back in the 1400s, he wrote down in his log, which is a very important document to write. You don't write in your captain's log for just, because you feel like you have nothing else to do. He wrote that something came up out of the ocean and lit up the entire night sky and flew off into the heavens. So what could that have been, since they didn't have any light pollution? They didn't have electricity and everything else. It sounds like it could have been one of these USOs.
Right. And that's what you said earlier about connecting the dots is, we might see one reference of a cultural belief and you look at this and say, oh, it's mythology. They're just depicting their gods.
Mm-hmm.
But when you can make those nuanced connections across the globe to other cultures, other references, and even modern references, it doesn't give us the answer, but it makes the question mark larger, of more importance, to be like, why?
Yeah, absolutely. Recently, we just took about 100 people on a tour of Egypt just back in October of this year, last year now. Yeah, the year's running by so fast now. And for the first time, I've seen this in Egypt. Now, I had heard about the very slender type beings, but I saw them depicted on some vases and some jars and some other pieces of artifact inside the Cairo Museum, which I had never seen them before. I had heard about them, but I had never got a chance to see them. I don't think the exhibit was up at the time I went, from 2014 and 18, whatever. And so now other cultures have talked about these slender type beings. Do you believe that there's some type of a race of slender beings, some call them ant people or whatever, that's linked to these ancient civilizations?
Billy, it's just one of those markers that I've seen across the globe where you have, in the Sumerian lexicon, there's various depictions of them being very pious, I think is the word, but you see them with their hands wrapped at the waist and they look very humble. And then, I noticed that this pose was happening across other cultures, and sometimes in the form of their gods. So when we go to like Göbekli Tepe, you see that there's these columns. And if you look closely, the beings that are depicted there, long, slender beings, hands wrapped at the waist. Yeah. Bada Valley in Indonesia, similar statues found. And the ones that really caught my attention were, the Moai heads at Rapa Nui, it's like, well, they're not just heads. Actually, when you excavate down, it's a long, slender body, hands wrapped at the waist. So I theorize that maybe, when we hear some of the more modern, like ancient apocalypse, I think I'm saying that right, because my book was called Knowledge Apocalypse. I get it confused.
Right.
Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse.
Yeah.
You see that there's an association with these, gods coming from around the world. They show up right after a great flood. And a lot of the depictions, again, seem to represent this possible race. Now, is it a lost race that departed from Atlantis and fed out to the other cultures? Possible. Or it's something else, right? But yeah, you do see, again, the marker of that type of a race, whoever they were, definitely leaving a chain of evidence.
Yeah, you see it everywhere. It's, and what's so crazy is, like you say, they seem to show up after these major events. Even just recently, I had some video footage analyzed by our editors that looked like something crawling through the smoke of the fires over LA. Just something, a glimmer of something moving that didn't. Yeah, just so weird. I had it sent to them. I want to find out from them, from their professional opinion, if this is one of those instances where they can't explain it. Because I send them a lot of stuff and they go, nope, no good, fake AI, whatever. So they can analyze it. So I'm looking forward to finding out if this is another one of those incidents where we have a catastrophe, and then these beings show up, because it seems like that happens throughout history. And I always wonder, do you think that they're guarding our skies, or do you think that someone's watching over us, or just observing, or are these the watchers? What's your opinion on that?
We're going to go down a rabbit hole with this question. I want to bring up something, and I won't forget at the end. It's called rods that fly through the air. If I forget, remind me to bring it up. Billy, I think that it's an open basket of what could it be. There's just a lot of stuff that's happening, obviously, flying around in our skies and such. So I love the theories and exploring, what we hear out there now around, giving it more of these official titles, like UFOs became UAPs. Fine. However, we can track them and still be on the same page. Great. NHI. Fine. Not aliens or extraterrestrials. You want to call them that? Same thing. So I feel like there's a baseline of conversation starting to take place that when we look at evidence like that, I tell my wife and others the same thing. It's like, if I tried to explain to you a thunder shower or a lightning storm, I'm like, man, I went outside, all this water started falling and these loud sounds and bolts of lightning. You're like, sounds dramatic.
Right.
Well, once you experience it, you're like, wow, a thunder shower. So it's the same thing with seeing paranormal phenomenon, especially things, like or what's being reported and like what we see in these videos. I just don't know until I see it firsthand. Quick segue to that, though, because, I know you'll appreciate this. I have something sitting here on my desk to just talk about that topic. So let's go ahead and show you something.
Yeah.
I look at the sky. This is the first time I've probably said this on camera, too. I look at the sky every night here where I live in Mission Viejo using these.
Nice. I love those.
Third gen, military grade night vision.
Yeah.
Nightvisionforless.com. Great site.
Nice.
So that, and this bad boy, a megawatt laser, which, don't really want to flash at it too many times, but every night at 6 p.m., I'm tracking these objects like you saw in that fire. They're not FAA blinking. They make no sound, and they're so high up there.
Yeah.
And they're going in different paths. I mean, several times there's like 6 in view, and I'm like, what is this? Some kind of a highway up there?
Right.
So I have no idea what those objects are, but I definitely am aware that, there are things flying around in our skies, if you're paying attention.
Yeah, there's definitely things up there. We did a UFO hunt 3 years in a row, and we went out to Giant Rock in the middle of the desert. And it's a great spot. We found this nice cliff that we can just hike up this cliff and camp out. And you're right, around a certain time, the sky just literally lights up with these moving objects. And so we take our satellite tracker with us on our apps, and we take the ISS tracker to make sure it's not the International Space Station. And of course, the flight trackers to make sure planes, right? So we're very careful to make sure we're not looking at technology that's ours. And yes, we have seen technology that is ours because we're tracking everything. But I'm telling you, we saw so many incredible things that weren't on the apps, that weren't being tracked by the ISS. There wasn't ISS. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't Starlink. It wasn't an airliner. What were these things? And some of them would connect and stop and then go around each other. And then one would take off lightning speed. Another one would slowly move. And then it's gone again. And the people we took were like blown away because some of them had never seen a UFO before. So I know what you're talking about. That dark sky, if you have the right technology like those infrared goggles you have, you can see some of the most incredible things while everyone's just walking around, living their lives. There's a whole thing going up in the sky that's so incredible. We need to start looking up more. I agree with you 1,000% on that.
I probably look like my neighbors will walk by and I'm just, it's dark and I'm just sitting there like this with this thing in my eye. And they're like, so, yeah. I mean, when you look at the sky through your naked eye, it is beautiful. Obviously, even from the desert where there's less ground light, but when you put on night vision goggles, it's a different experience. You're like, wow, all that is there. And when you pay attention, there's other things there.
Yeah. We were at Egypt. We were in Egypt, I think it was 2 years ago. And we had about 75, 80 people with us on a tour. We were standing inside the Sphinx enclosure on a sunrise tour, VIP sunrise tour. Nice. And while we're there, it was phenomenal. And we were showing them the enclosure wall and how it's, you can see the weather pattern, the weathering from erosion of water moving across from west to the east. And while we're doing that, one of the people who had their cameras out recording us says, "What is that?" And we record this object flying around above us, and it moves, and it just takes off and disappears. Nice. And we've got it on video. Yeah, a good video too, which I'll add to this video.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. The only, like my wife's like, well, you should start recording these. And I say to her, well, why? So I can add to the dots, the collection of dots flying in the sky. There's nothing I can do, right? It's one of those things where it's like, if you put these on and look at the sky and you walk away going, watching a video of it's not the same, right?
No, it's not. It's never the same as seeing it in person. It's like saying you saw the pyramids on a documentary or on Google instead of being directly at the base of the pyramid itself. It's two totally different things.
Right. This sounds like the basis of a movie called Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, right, exactly. I know, right? And speaking about these flying things in the sky that we can't identify, talk to us a little bit about Pakal, Lord Pakal and his sarcophagus lid.
There's a lot of these artifacts that we have of a representation of flight across various cultures. And, Pakal's tomb, I think, is a really interesting one to highlight. One, because his tomb is built literally underneath a pyramid. This slab is so large, there's no way that they could have built the pyramid and then brought it underneath there. So his tomb was literally constructed and a pyramid was placed on top of it. And the sarcophagus lid, very clearly depicts, you can just Google Pakal with a P and then a K, Pakal. Yeah. And you see what looks like him, seated upright, and he's he's holding levers and gears. He's got a nose apparatus. He's seated in a vertical position, just like our astronauts when they're in a rocket ship. And, you literally see depictions of what look like flames coming out the bottom. So that depiction of Pakal is very interesting, again, when we look across cultures. And you see that the Sumerians had even a word for something called the Shem that would detach and come down to the surface. And it looks like a landing capsule, like we use the same thing, the parachute opens and it comes. I mean, it literally looks like the same thing. So you see a lot of these different things. I found a tomb of a governor called Hoi, an Egyptian governor, and on the cover of his tomb is an inscription that shows what appear to be like animals and plant level, giraffes and such. But then there's a ground level, and it clearly looks like a rocket going, like it's sitting underground, and you can see people that are inside the rocket. And so I think a lot of these depictions, again, are just showing us that, the ancients were aware of and were probably utilizing through the gods in some form the power of flight. When you go to sites like Baalbek in Lebanon, and you hear about the ancient tales of Baal and even the visiting people like King Gilgamesh and some of these greats that have come there, and they're like, you know what, I saw the gods going off and coming up in these loud sounds of smoke and fire. Sounds like a rocket ship. I don't know why they were using rockets, but there you go.
Yeah. It's when you read these ancient accounts of these flying machines, it's strange because some of them make so much rumbling and noise, just like our modern day rockets. And some of them have the ability to fly silent. It's almost like the evolution of technology took place prior to us learning about chemical rockets and rocketry. Eventually, we'll have devices. I think the U.S. military probably has flying machines that don't make a lot of sound, probably like the TR-3B, the Flying Triangle, the Aurora project, and some other technologies that are black budget projects. So it's almost like we're just repeating a cycle again. It's not like, it seems like we're just rediscovering something that already exists. And it might be that our scientists and researchers are just investigating the ancient past and taking ideas from what happened before and then reinventing it now.
Oh, most definitely. The whole rocket thing, though, it does trip me up a little bit as an ancient technology researcher. I'm like, well, where's the UFO? Where's the, gravitic mercury plasma driven drive that, like, there it is, It's like, so a lot of these depictions, right, of this more primitive form of technology, I still, again, start to equate it to, I agree with you. There's an evolution perhaps in the types of tech that was used. Not sure why. Maybe it's just, cultural. But there could be a similarity with, for instance, let's say the Anunnaki theoretically used some form of a rocket. It could be very interesting that Werner von Braun and others were like, rockets. And then if you look at rockets today, like, they're like self-landing themselves. And like, it's, you're going to be like, oh, look, it's a rocket landing. Yeah, no big deal.
Yeah.
So maybe the technology for us in the next 20 years with AI and things with rockets and other forms of propulsion that can be harnessed without having to be like a civilization zero and we're taking it from the planet. Maybe there's some other way where we're like, oh, look, rocket fuel can be synthesized out of water. We might start to look again at the ancient evidence of rockets and see a deeper connection that's still just not apparent to us yet. Because I too have wondered, why, if you're coming here from Nibiru or something, you have showing us you're traveling from Mars to Earth and other places. Were you using rockets? I still don't know.
Yeah, it's a mind-boggling thing. One of the theories I came up with, just a theory, was that potentially there could have been a breaking off where they got here through higher levels of technology, prior generations, and then one or two generations may have felt like they were stuck here. Somehow the technology of flight and interplanetary travel got lost, and they were redeveloping technologies trying to get back into space, so they started developing rocketry. I was just thinking, like, hypothesizing what would happen here if, we were an advanced civilization with anti-gravity, and then all of a sudden we had an EMP that destroyed all the communications, all the electronics, and we couldn't communicate for a while. And we went back almost to like a Bronze Age type civilization, and we had to rebuild again. We don't know. I mean, I know how anti-gravity works by just, talking about it, but I can't build it. So maybe you'll say, well, we still have to travel in some way. We gotta utilize what we do know how to make. And maybe we'll make some rockets and some combustion engines and so forth. And so kind of working our way back up towards high levels of technology. That's only a hypothesis or a theory that I came up with.
I like that theory. I would throw at you to say that at one point the gods chose to come down and confuse all of our languages. Maybe that's a truncated version of saying they wiped out all of our tech and EMP'd us and we couldn't do anything and we had to rebuild.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah, there's that same evidence again of the Tower of Babel. Why is it that culturally we were not able to work together, and as soon as we came together to reach the heavens again, literally, it says this in the Bible. They came down and confused our languages. So And it's interesting too that the Sumerian depictions of the Tower of Babel, at the top, there's two suns depicted.
That's
almost
right.
as if they knew that we might be a binary star system, which is a whole other conversation that we might touch on as far as cycles of time and such. But,
Yeah.
we get
that's so true.
pieces of evidence, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what it's all about. Just researching and looking for every single glimmer of evidence or information or corroborating evidence that we can discover so that we can just create paint ourselves a better picture. It doesn't mean that we're 1,000% right. It just means that we're using circumstantial evidence to paint a picture so that we can have maybe a clearer vision of what may have happened in the ancient past.
I usually try and tell people, look, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm still trying to learn myself.
Yeah.
What I can do is say, here's the evidence that led up to me having an opinion. I base my opinion on all this stuff. Let me share it with you. You decide. And there's no other way I can really do that. I'm very respectful to everyone's beliefs and ideas, because, that's how we learn and grow.
Very true. Very true. And speaking of this, these cycles of technology and rise and fall of civilizations, do you think the Mayan calendar tried to predict the end of time in 2012?
I think it was partly the media and in our civilization in current times, not understanding cycles of time, right? So we looked at that and said, oh my God, it's another doomsday date. They've predicted it. No, it turns out that, the Mayans had multiple calendars that were, served different purposes. And they had this long count calendar that was more for predictions. And, on that calendar, separate from the one about like cycles of time, but on this prediction calendar, they said, at a certain time, our god Kukulkan is going to return. And, there were signs, a comet showed up and the advisors were like, look, dude, his sign, Kukulkan's coming. Yeah. And so when the conquistadors showed up, they were very fearful that, oh my God, it's Kukulkan. He's going to like wipe us out because we were following Huitzilopochtli, this, bad god essentially. Yeah. And so they were like fearful, and they adorned the conquistadors with all their gold and assets and such. And what do they do? First of all, the priests and the conquistadors were very much, were scared of the level of technology and understanding of the movements of the heavens that they presented. It was way beyond what they could, comprehend. And so that scared them, and they destroyed all of their knowledge, burned all their codices, So, it's a real interesting way to look at, some of the ways advanced knowledge has been perceived by other cultures. And the Mayans definitely had that glimpse of predictions that not always came right, but their calendar system was extremely accurate. And they showed cycles of time, right? So 2012 was just basically the ending of an age, the age of Aquarius. They knew that, every 2,000 years, there's this new North Star, that there's cycles of time. So it's just like the clock hitting midnight. It just keeps going again, right? And so that was the understanding, is to realize we're now moving into a new age. What does that mean? We've jumped from Pisces to Aquarius. And, everyone can think of that as, again, more mythological and fuzzy and such. But when you look into the data, you could literally track how Pisces, Jesus, that whole time period since 2012 has kind of shifted its focus, and non-traditional ideas, non-North American white traditional ideas, thank God, have been expanded, right? To a much more accurate set of saying, well, where do we really come from? So that's just in alignment with the age of Aquarius, an expansion of knowledge. So I find that interesting that there are these cycles, that we can point to and trying to understand how does it affect us sometimes on larger scales of time.
Right. Yeah. And, it's mind blowing, these cycles of time, because, this precession of the equinox, they call it the great year. And, that's the movement of the constellations across the sky. And like you said, we're heading into the age of Aquarius now, which, like you said, thank God, it's time for awakening. It's time for enlightenment. but they're not going to go without any kicking and screaming. But we're kicking and kicking and screaming our way into this movement of this age of Aquarius, where we are going to start to think for ourselves a little more, ask more questions, and seek more answers, and even stop complaining about problems, become part of the solutions to problems. And when I look back at this whole Mayan thing, and I researched them very heavily, I've been down there so many times, the sacrifices that they used to make and pulling people's hearts out while they were still beating, and throwing virgins in what they call a well, but it doesn't look like a well. It looks like a silo to me. But that's a whole other podcast. But this barbaric mentality, but also then having this other supposed level of super sophistication, it almost seems as if their civilization were influenced by these gods or these people, these advanced beings that had this advanced knowledge. And at some point, these people were left. They disappeared, and they became revered, and they became deified by the Mayans. But generations later, they just became maybe a cargo cult where they really didn't have the super advanced knowledge as their ancestors did. And the evidence of that maybe could be the fact that they were pulling these hearts out and sacrificing virgins and sacrificing the ball court players. It just didn't seem to me like a civilization that was so high level and so advanced could then and build pyramids and these structures in the particular ways that they are, and all the alignments that they discovered with the stars, and then rip somebody's heart out while it was still beating. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
That's an interesting point, Billy. Let me shed a little bit of information on that I recently was researching for some of the ancient alien data, one of the episodes, specifically on the Mayan gods. And looking into some of the research there, it's interesting because when we go to sites like Chichen Itza and we see, this pyramid, and it's dedicated to the feathered serpent Kukulkan, and the duality of some of these other places where you have these large city centers where they were putting skulls on spikes and sacrifice and such. There's an interesting duality that's come to light in the sense that most of these cultures seem to have a dichotomy of either between two brothers or between like Zeus and Prometheus, Enki and Enlil. One's good, one's a champion of mankind, one's not. One wants to give knowledge to man, Prometheus. One wants to keep it, Zeus. And we see the same thing playing out in the Mayan culture, where one of the relatives, I believe it was his brother, is this god Huitzilopochtli, and he's the brother of Kukulkan. And I have to fact check what I'm saying, but I'm pretty sure that he's a relative, and it could be his brother. But this other god Huitzilopochtli eventually pushed Kukulkan out, and he sailed away on this serpent vessel. But what's interesting is that Huitzilopochtli replaced the offerings of incense and flowers and passion and love and all the things that Kukulkan was a part of. And now Huitzilopochtli is like, I want sacrificial. I am the god of darkness and of chaos, and I want suffering and pain. And that somehow the sacrifice, the hearts, there was some other things going on where if he's non-human, perhaps taking the energy, the life force of these beings being sacrificed was feeding him in a way where we don't understand. Yeah. But there is a duality of gods across cultures, one good for man, one bad, and they war against each other. And you see that playing out in the Mayan culture, just the same between Huitzilopochtli and Kukulkan. And you wonder again, is this a mythological tale being told from an older civilization's tale, or is it just happening across cultures? Sometimes I'm not sure about that part.
Yeah. It's really intriguing, man. It's so intriguing, and what you're right about that dichotomy between the two. It's that yin and yang, that dark, that light, the good and evil. In the biblical text in Isaiah 47, it says, I created the good and I create the evil. Do what I saith the Lord. So it's letting you know there, even from that text, that somehow the good and the evil is coming from one source, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
The biblical information, and just pivoting quickly away from the Mayans, but the biblical information around these topics has been very strong, and sometimes even with censorship. I was raised as a Christian. Was never religious, though. I had a very strong Christian presence in my life. My aunt is still a pastor, but
Nice.
it just never was my religion of choice. It was like, well, there's all these religions, and I learned something from all of them. This is where I stand, peacefully. But it is interesting to note that, when I started looking into the Sumerian information and realizing that we're talking about, there's a English New King James version, and then there's an Old Testament Hebrew version. Keeps going. There's an Akkadian version, and then a Sumerian version. And so a lot of these source information, that we have in these older Sumerian, Akkadian, the descriptions are much longer. Instead of like 7 days of creation, you have 7 tablets of creation, part of a much longer set, right? So, I found it very interesting that in the 20 years of looking into the Sumerian information and really understanding the biblical origins of trying to verify, uphold the biblical veracity of what's being said, not challenge it and saying it's wrong, but saying this stuff is true. It turns out that, there's lots of Christian proponents in our ufology zone that over time always demolished Zecharia Sitchin. The best researcher that spent 50 years really bringing to light a lot of these initial awarenesses of the Anunnaki, the Sumerians. And while he was alive, he was vehemently attacked, you know what I mean? And, others were like, look, you're wrong. And if you look into your background, certain people that were saying these things, it was always a religious bias. They're a Christian, they're this, they're that, they're a biblical scholar. But they never approached it like Zecharia Sitchin. And I would say to them, or anyone, I'd say, well, if you take Zecharia Sitchin, looking at the text and the linguistic angle, and then you take Eric von Daniken, and he's got the physical evidence and the sites and the locations, and you put them together, that's the ancient astronaut theory. So it's really interesting that when Sitchin passed away, the level of incredulity on he's wrong and he was always wrong went like 300%. There's a website out there called sitchiniswrong.com, and it's by an author. You know what I mean? And one day I thought, for fun, I'm going to just go ahead and launch sitchinisright.com, which is still live. And it's interesting that battle of attacking this information has only come from a few voices that were just using it to, I guess, make a living or something.
I call it cloud chasing.
Cloud chasing. My ending point is it's a very interesting, turn of events when we look at like what's happening today, and you flip on the news or look in the paper or you see what current topics are. I would say to those people, if you look over your head right now, there's a large plane that's spelling out in smoke. I told you so.
That's a fact. That's something that they don't even talk about, and they can't deny it. It's right there, and it's being presented to us almost on a day-by-day basis at this moment. Everything we talked about for the last 30 years is coming to fruition and being not that it hadn't existed, but the fruition for it is actually it's being validated, and that's what I love. We're living in a time of validation where things that we talked about, so many different things, even outside of the UFO and ancient astronaut theory, are being validated, and it's got people scratching their heads.
All kinds of science and other topics
that's right.
Even with technology and AI and such, we're getting exponential amounts of learning. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive, really. I mean, some people see it as a doomsday event, but I don't see it as the end. I see it as the beginning.
I heard somewhere, real quickly, Billy, I heard somewhere, around thought that, if you maintain a thought for 16 seconds and take it beyond that, you're actually helping materialize what you want, right? And so that can be a good thing if you're focusing on obtaining things that are going to help benefit your life or your family, and you spend more than 16 seconds focusing on that and bringing it to fruition. It's not a bad thing, but perhaps don't spend more than 16 seconds saying bad things or worrying about, oh my God, the end of the world. There's a planet hiding behind the sun and it's going to kill us. What can you do about it?
Right.
Nothing.
Don't
worry about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Plus, it's probably not even true. So don't worry about it,
Yeah. Yeah. Just live your life, man, and enjoy your family, enjoy your friends, love one another, and try to be the best of assistance you can to everybody, and follow your passions. That's really what living is all about.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
That's a good life philosophy for sure.
Yeah, man. In these ancient texts, they talk about these other beings called the Igigi. I kind of liken them to a worker race because it says that they did a lot of the work, but they didn't seem to be slaves. So if I had a construction company, I would have a master architect who would draw up a blueprint, and that blueprint would be given to like an engineer and a foreman, and then they would then go out and hire people to do the actual physical labor. So it seems like the Igigi were on the physical labor level of this pyramid of work. And it seems like they may have been running a concurrent civilization on Earth and also on Mars. I just get that from a lot of the anomalies that you've seen us find over many, many years. What's your theory about what might be going on? Is there a cover-up going on Mars by NASA?
Well, let me start off by talking specifically about the Igigi, because that in its own is its own egg to crack open. You see these depictions in ancient Sumerian times. They're held in the British Museum, the Louvre, a couple other places in Turkey. And there's these figurines that are depicted and described as Igigi. Now, some of them look, almost kind of reptilian, long and slender. They have these long heads and slanted eyes. And you're like, well, what are those figurines? Others very much resemble a modern day gray alien. They've got large bulbous heads, large oversized eyes, and they're shown in different shapes and sizes, sometimes as a trio where one's larger than the other two. And, I look at those and I'm like, okay, well, again, if it was just that specific cultural reference saying, oh, look, it's little figurines, what did it mean? I see very specific references. When we look at those little Igigi, those statues resemble very much the modern day grays. Now, the Igigi are mentioned in Sumerian times as helpers of the Anunnaki, helping in medical experiments, helping fly their craft, right? And you mentioned Mars and such. We can talk about that. Yeah. So I don't know how advanced these were, but there were texts that said you could speak to a certain Igigi and ask a set of questions to determine whether it was alive or acting as if. That almost sounds like an android or a robot.
It sounds like R2D2.
There's a little bit of confusion there, but the overlap is in the visual depictions of these Igigi. They look like gray aliens. They're mentioned as helpers of medical experiments. When you see today, depictions of a lot of alien abduction scenarios, and you hear scenarios of people being abducted, what do we have? It has to do with some type of biological checkup, maybe something with reproductivity, right? But it's something medical related. And even Whitley Strieber, there's only a handful of us, that, in this field, right, that stood out and said, oh, let me visualize my experience. Go watch the movie Communion. You see these little gray people, right, come in and like carry them off. I'm just wondering if these all are a subset, yes, like you mentioned, of a worker, some participant that's doing their part of the labor. A lot of abductions have this trio of the smaller people, one larger, either praying mantis-like, or even sometimes Nordic presence. And, just a lot of that information, again, I think is mixed and interwoven between ancient references and modern day, abduction information.
Yeah. It's really, really wild stuff, man. And there's so many anomalies on Mars. I don't know, but I can't say I know, but I feel like Elon Musk has to have seen some of these space anomalies from so many incredible researchers that have been, downloading a lot of these images over the years. And he's got to be either scratching his head, or maybe I don't know. We don't know. We're not him. We're not privy to his conversations and so forth. But man, I would love to go to Mars and explore that place. That's all I could tell you.
Well, I'll give you the Twitter version of my background and how I got started in this. When I was in college in San Diego, I was just a waiter and a surfer. No interest in aliens or other planets, NASA. Someone had mentioned about there being a possible face on Mars and pyramids. And, I was like, what? Why would they hide this? And as a college student, I just looked into it. And it turned out that the principal subcontractor for NASA that's taking most of the photos that are on either the orbiters or the landers is called Mayan Space Science Systems, which is also located in San Diego. And I thought, oh, okay. I'm just a college student. I'm going to call up Dr. Mike Malin and ask him, is the face in pyramids on Mars artificial? And after a few successive attempts, I finally got a communication that he said, no, the face in pyramids are all natural, weather erosion, no aliens or humans. And that really made my eyebrows go, wait a minute. I found 5 to 10 peer level review scientists that had PhD credentials to analyze satellite telemetry, pictures of the Earth, pictures of Mars. And one gentleman in particular, Dr. Mark Carlotto, who was a imaging specialist, developed a set of fractal algorithms using basically math to detect artificial structures. And when he ran his fractal analysis over like satellite images of Russia, he'd be like, oh, look, troops, people, tanks. When he ran his fractal analysis over Cydonia, this region on Mars where there's a face and an ancient city, 98% probability hits on the face pyramids to be artificial.
Wow.
NASA.
Yeah, they don't want to say anything about it.
Yeah, that's what initially really caught my attention. And I spent years looking through Mayan Space Science System archives for imagery, collaborating with, finders like Vincent DiPietro and Greg Molinar, the DNM Pyramid, Dr. Mark Carlotto, and others that, did Richard Hoagland, also a prominent researcher that, over time, there's been several people who have raised the flag. So I hope Elon goes, and I've already done my best saying, you know what, if you want a proposal to send some drones or some things over to that area when you land, you could kind of validate an extraterrestrial archaeological presence. What do you think?
Yeah, I love it, man. I'm in, because some of the things that we've seen have looked like, and I can't say they are, but some of them have actually made Ancient Aliens, a show that you're on and I've been on a couple times. Things that look like fallen statues. That was discovered by Martine Graney, one of our greatest anomaly hunters. Things that look like buildings or structures that have collapsed. There's even something that kind of looks like it was an airplane of some type. Not saying it was an airplane, but I'm just saying from what we can see in the imagery, the telemetry, it looks like some type of a rundown craft of some type or sort. And there's so many things there. It looks like 2 particular objects look like fallen people that have maybe died in a spot. And I'm not saying they are. It could just be what they call pareidolia, right? But what I'm saying is, when you see so many of these objects within just a small area, seeing an anomaly once every few miles or so, but seeing like 15, 20 anomalies within only a few feet of one another, all of a sudden you have to say circumstantial evidence, and you have to start scratching your head and saying, why aren't they talking about this? Why aren't they making this broadcast, evening news?
Right. CNN.
Something going on.
If you look at the relationship of those objects, you'll find there's a lot of math and geometry displayed in the crossovers. And also anyone, even yourself, if you do repodcast this and put a visual in it, you can show that any shot of Mars over the Cydonia region, if you just zoom out a little bit, the face and the objects that are the city, they're right on an ancient shoreline. All the pyramidal objects, you can make out an ancient shoreline where it's brighter, knobbier terrain. You'll see a shoreline change, and then boom, the face is there, as if it's sitting like a monument, like the Statue of Liberty. It's surrounded by water. Why? Because everybody loves waterfront property.
That's right.
And even on Mars, they built Cydonia right on a shoreline. And if you just look at it for a minute, you can clearly see a topographical change where it becomes an ocean where the face is.
Yeah, no doubt about it. You know what's also so incredible about that region? If you take an ordnance map from Avebury in the UK on Earth, take an ordnance map. You can download this ordnance map. Anyone can just Google Avebury UK ordnance map. You can download it. There are these hills out there that are manufactured, that are made by man. They're not naturally occurring hills, right? When you overlay them over Cydonia, even the paths to the hills and everything else, 19.5 degree angles, they align perfectly with the 5-sided pyramid and the cities on Mars, in Cydonia. Yeah.
That's nuts. Yeah.
Wild.
Oh, look
Wild
here.
Stuff.
Just coincidence.
Yeah, I know, right? Just another coincidence But yeah, so there is a
That's
connection
amazing.
between Earth and Mars, not only in ancient texts and tablets, but even in something that we built a monument on Earth to Cydonia. In my opinion, I think that's what it is. And what do you think that Elon will see on Mars when we finally get there?
You know, I don't know, but there's a great video that's circulating on. I think it still exists on YouTube. If you type it in, it's called Alternative 3. And it's this fictitious UK video that was made in like the late 60s, early 70s, and they were kidnapping scientists and taking them to Mars. And at the end of the video, it shows Russian scientists in the late 60s in color landing on Mars. Of course, fictitious, but the first things that happen is, boop, we've landed. And what is that? What is this off to the side? And you see something scurrying away, going under the dirt, moving under the dirt, some life on Mars, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think archaeologically, it's just going to take one finding of a set of bones or a skull, and they're going to be like, humans were here.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things about Mars, I started doing a lot of research on the geology of Mars, and I discovered a few things that were really interesting. Number one, Mars is still producing oxygen. Now, of course, oxygen is still escaping into the atmosphere and up into space, but at a rate where it's still holding a certain amount of oxygen on the planet. Now, is it like the same level we have here on Earth? No, but there is oxygen being produced on Mars. So something is producing oxygen, which is very interesting because on Earth, we know that plants produce oxygen. So it's like, wait a minute, where's this oxygen coming from? Where's all this methane coming from? We know on Earth that bacteria, right, algae, they produce methane and things like that. So where's the methane coming from? Is there life there that's producing high levels of methane? And then they also started saying, well, in the beginning, where there's no magnetic field, but now they found isolated magnetic fields on the planet. Plus, they've also discovered that because Mars spins on its axis at almost the same rate that Earth does, and it's moving around the sun, it creates something called bow shock, which bends the radiation around the planet, and the magnetic fields are just enough to protect things that are directly on the surface itself. So if there is life right at the surface or beneath the surface, real scientists are saying it's quite possible, now that they have found liquid water on Mars, and they just found another lake a couple of days ago, by the way. They made it a public statement about it, a press release, another huge lake on Mars of liquid water, that potentially there could be some life on Mars. And I really think they may give us this alien disclosure soon, within the next 5 years, that they've discovered an alien, and the alien is going to be bacteria on Mars.
That's an interesting point, Billy. A couple things there. So I know we're getting close on time.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the, like oceans that we have in the solar system, like on the moons of Europa, one of the moons out there that has an ice sheet and 40-mile ocean underneath it, and other moons of Jupiter, like Ganymede, Callisto, they're very hot and volcanic. And Europa is watery. So if you take heat and water, you have life. It's very possible that you could go down to the bottom depths of Europa, and there could be thermal vents with lots of life. Just like here on Earth, you can go where there's no sunlight, bottom of the ocean, thermal vent, teeming with life. So there's lots of places, I think, for us to find or confirm that there's life. But I know from my own research with Mars, I've spent years looking at this footage, again, manually, right? Mail and Space Science Systems, ESA, and now even, Japan, I think maybe even some of the other, like China, they have either a presence or they're sending probes there. So you get to have an expanded view of the photography that's not just NASA. And I remember about 15 years ago, the Gusev crater, when I looked at it from Mail and Space Science Systems in black and white, I was like, what is that stuff?
Yeah.
Are those trees? Are those plants? Along comes ESA and does the Gusev crater in color. All that stuff is bright green.
Yes.
I mean, what is that, right? It's something biological. It's some type of chlorophyll-based something,
There's no doubt about it. And speaking of Cydonia, well, we get back to Earth a little bit. Cydonia, I believe, is an ancient term for Cairo. And so there definitely is this link between
a Mars
Cairo
Earth
and
connection.
Cydonia. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, the Sphinx and pyramids on Earth, again, the pyramids and the face on Mars, there's a linkage. And I've shown a lot, in my research, where the face on Mars, when you cut it in half and clone the left side and then clone the right side, you see these facial characteristics come out, that it's clearly a face, but it also looks Egyptian and lion-like, and there's the winged disc on there. And so it can't be coincidence that there's some type of connection.
Yeah, definitely connection. And speaking of those connections, and understanding that whatever's on Mars has to be really old. How old do you think these sites like Göbekli Tepe, the Great Pyramid at Giza, and then and the complex there, and some of these other ancient sites around the world, how old do you think they are?
Well, when we look at the geological evidence, that's one of the ways that I like to show people, is to look at geological evidence and try and date stuff. The pyramids and the Sphinx could be obviously much older than 2500 BC. No, at least 13,000, 10,000 plus. When we look at the evidence geologically, the Nile itself used to come up right to the shores of the pyramids. Like the pharaoh could cruise down and get on the Nile. And now you look how far the Nile is meandered away on Google Maps. You can see how long geologically it's taken for those types of movements. If you look over in like Lake Titicaca, and you can see Machu Picchu way up there, and Cusco. But if you look closely at Lake Titicaca, you can see that it's receded massively. And the shorelines used to lap right on the shores of Machu Picchu at Cusco. Again, geological changes that we can date. So you can look around the world and see that these cultures, again, always waterfront property. And two, how long has it been since some of those civilizations, the water areas around them, have meandered or changed? And it has nothing to do with, cultural differences. It's just a matter of time of saying, how long did that take place?
Right. Exactly. So much, man. I know we're running out of time. I got one more question for you.
Yeah.
What about, the fact that I want to say it's a fact. What about the concept or the theory that we're living in a binary star system, which I believe is quite possible? But what do you think about that?
Well, all the evidence is pointing to the idea that we might have two suns, that we're in a binary orbit, right? So there's always been these discussions, especially with our research, where a Nibiru or a 10th planet, how could it have such an elongated elliptical orbit? Well, it's because it's looping around a second sun and coming back this way. So even in like 1980s, I think a 1986 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica Science Edition, it'll show you there, oh, look, there's a 10th planet and there's also a second sun, and it's looping around. So there's been this information for quite a long time that if you go beyond Pluto, billions of miles, there's this thing we call the Oort cloud, and it's like another asteroid belt. So they've shown that for a long time, most likely comets and asteroids maybe were being dislodged from there on a millions of year cycle. And that's what destroyed the dinosaurs, is some of the debris coming from the Oort cloud. So it's interesting that when we look at time right now, it's based on precession of the equinox. And that is basically saying that there's a wobble because of the moon, and every 72 years, there's like a slight 1 degree change. It's very complex how they perceive precession today, but the ancients had a much more interesting way. And it could be that there's basically us orbiting another sun. If you imagine our sun orbiting another sun, if you can imagine our sun not static but in motion, all the little planets orbiting the sun, they're going along for the ride, and we're all moving through space.
Yep.
It's very hard for our mind to imagine not a static solar system of sun, planets moving around, sun moving through space, planets moving around with it. Much more complex. But if we look at that model, it starts to describe how over 30 ancient cultures were aware of this cycle of time and were measuring it and could tell if they were going into a dark age or going into the next golden age. And that cycle of time seems to like coincide with rise and fall of civilizations, right? So the dark ages is kind of like Game of Thrones, very raw, and everyone's just kill and get and collect. Whereas, the golden age, right, is more like this. It's written about in ancient Hindu scripts where man reaches a point where he can actually interpret God.
Yeah.
We're nowhere near that, right? So, but maybe we get there and then again, we lose this knowledge and have to relearn. So we're on that path of relearning fast, it feels, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful, man. Listen, there's so much we can talk about. We got to do a part 2.
For sure.
Absolutely. This has been phenomenal and enlightening. And I'm sure that the people that follow these channels and this podcast is going to get a great deal of knowledge and information out of this. And remember what we always say, don't believe what we say, research what we say. Make sure you guys look it up and become a researcher yourself. And so, Jason, where can people find you?
Well, conveniently, you can just go to ancientastronauts.com. And there's some fun explorations into the research and some fun tools using AI and other things that can fascinate you. So feel free to check it out.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Thanks again, man. And congrats on your tour with Ancient Aliens. And I look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Have a great day, Billy. Talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, man. Peace. Watch this video for free at www.4bk.tv or download the app on your smartphone, Fire Stick app, Samsung TV, Roku, and other app providers.